Hi guys, welcome back to my channel. So good to be here. I hope you all are doing good. I am back today with another reaction. I'm gonna be checking out why Poland has a complicated history. This is by Thomas Sowell. I am so interested in knowing histories, and plus the fact that my husband comes from Poland and I'm trying to learn more about Poland. So I really don't know anything about them, just a little one or two things, but this is going to be so good, tracing back to the history and know why it's a little bit complicated. Isn't it good? I know. Yeah, I should. So at least I'll be able to tell stories someday, All right, let's dive right into it.
Unlike the emergence of some peoples from tribal societies to national states through internal consolidations, whether peaceful or bloody, the emergence of modern Slavic states has been largely through armed struggles against foreign conquerors. The uprisings of the Serbs against the Ottoman Empire and the Russians driving back of Mongol conquerors before conquering them in turn have been part of a pattern of the emergence of Slavic peoples into nation-states of their own. Poland has likewise played the role of both conqueror and conquered, including its obliteration as an independent state for more than a century following the carving up of its territory by Russia, Prussia, and Austria in 1795. The collapse and dismemberment of the Habsburg and Ottoman empires in the wake of the First World War freed more Slavic peoples to form more nation-states, for the first time in the case of Czechoslovakia and Yugoslavia, and as an historic resurrection in the case of Poland. The Poland that emerged at the end of the First World War had very different borders from the Poland which existed in the 13th to 15th centuries, much less the expansive Poland that once included Lithuania and Ukraine in the 16th century, when the Polish Commonwealth was one of the dominant powers on the European continent. The country's dismemberment at the end of the 18th century resulted in Russia's acquiring 62% of Poland's land and 45% of its people, with Prussia taking 20% of the land and 23% of the people, while Austria took 18% of the land and 32% of the people.
Which means Poland was quite massive then. It was like a very big, if other countries were able to take like some other parts from, it must have been like a very big country, before now.
Partition of Poland meant not only the Poles' loss of political independence, but also that Polish producers and their markets were now often separated by national boundaries, and the varying policies of the three conquering nations led to very different roles for the Poles in the differing larger economies of which they were now a part. Railroads, for example, connected the Polish regions of Russia, Prussia, and Austria, not with each other, but with other regions of the respective empires of which they were now part. Although Poland had been and remained well into the 20th century a predominantly agricultural country, such industrial development as took place there in the 18th and 19th centuries, using imported Western European technology and then Western European investment, made the Polish regions of the Russian Empire the most industrially advanced part of the Tsarist realm. The real wages of industrial workers in these Polish regions were accordingly higher than the real wages of industrial workers in Russia as a whole, though lower than the real wages of such workers in Western Europe. This was in keeping with the intermediary role of the Polish provinces as conduits for Western technology moving eastward into the less developed Russian Empire. In Prussia, however, the role of the Polish regions was quite different. Prussia, and especially the United Germany which succeeded it, was a nation with earlier access to Western European technology. Here the Poles played a very different role, as suppliers of agricultural produce and raw materials for German industry, as well as supplying both agricultural laborers and a workforce for parts of German industry. But, although Poles tended to be backward parts of the German economy, as contrasted with advanced parts of the Russian economy, the absolute standard of living of Poles under German hegemony was higher than that of Poles living under either Russian or Austrian rule, simply because the Germans had a more advanced economy than those of their neighbors to the east and south.
That's interesting.
Poles in Germany were not simply passive recipients of a higher standard of living, however. They were better educated and harder working than fellow Poles living in Russia or in the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Their agriculture was better organized, increasingly used machinery, and had higher yields than farms in the Polish regions of Russia. It was the Poles from Prussia who constituted most of the skilled workers among Polish immigrants to the United States.
Wow.
In the Austro-Hungarian Empire, the Austrian and the Czech regions were in the forefront of Western technology and industry, while the Poles in Galicia supplied agricultural products and other raw materials. Moreover, poverty.
So in general, to say, because I hear like a Pole in Russia, Pole in Germany, and all that, it feels like the Poles that were in there in those countries were like the really hardworking ones. They were really hardworking, and naturally, I always feel like they're very hardworking people. So it's not, it's actually very interesting to know that that actually led back to, those days, like back in the history, and they're really hardworking, because I see that they said they're very good in agriculture, and that was really good.
It was rampant in this province. The estimated per capita food consumption in Galicia in the late 19th century was only half that in Europe as a whole. Yet, in this empire, there were fewer restrictions on the Polish language and culture than in Russia or Prussia, so that Galicia became a cultural center for Poles in the late 19th century, with an influence radiating into the Polish communities of neighboring countries. Moreover, stringent restrictions on the Polish language and culture in Russia and Prussia were not always effective and were not supinely accepted by the Poles. For example, a crackdown by the Tsarist secret police in 1882 to 1883 uncovered 100 clandestine Polish schools. At the same time, Lithuanian and Ukrainian nationalism were developing, destroying the political and cultural ties they had once had with the Poles in an earlier era, when they were all part of the Polish Commonwealth, so that the re-establishment of that Commonwealth was no longer even a goal among these people living under Russian rule, who were now seeking an independent Lithuania, an independent Ukraine, and an independent Poland. Despite a variety of political movements and unsuccessful insurrections among the Poles, and a variety of changing responses by the conquering nations, as the 19th century neared its end, there was little indication that an independent Poland was going to be reconstituted in the foreseeable future. On the other hand, there was little indication of Polish satisfaction with their existing situation. During the era of mass emigration from 1870 to 1914, there was heavy emigration of Poles from the Polish regions of Russia, Prussia, and Galicia, more than 1 million people from each of these regions. However, economic progress continued largely through the importation of the technology of Western Europe. Electricity, for example, came into wider use, and Warsaw and several other Polish cities had their own power plants. Between 1894 and 1904, electric streetcars began to run in Warsaw, Lemberg, and Krakow, and telephones and automobiles began to appear, at least among the prosperous.
Listening to all of this, it's a bit complicated for me. I'm trying to, because he keeps saying Russian Poles, is it Prussian Poles and German Poles? So I don't know if maybe some of the Poles migrated into the different countries, and remained there as an indigenes under those countries. And it's a bit really complicated for me to know why it's that separated. And I feel like, and I heard that there were like other countries that were joined together with Poles. Is it Lithuania and Ukraine? And I really am trying to get to understand. It's a little complicated because I really know nothing about this history, and that's why I really need to dig deep to learn more. It's quite interesting following such histories.
During the course of the First World War, Germany and Austria invaded Russia, and the territory they conquered included the Polish regions of that country, giving these powers control of all historic Poland. However, at the end of the war, the victory of the Western Allies and the weakness of the new communist government in Moscow left the West with the question of how to dispose of the lands of the defeated powers. Their decision was to recreate Poland. When Poland was reconstituted as an independent nation, it was
Okay.
composed of regions that had developed economically as parts of the very different economies of Russia, Germany, and the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and had of course reached very different levels of development. Railroad networks, for example, were far more developed in the Polish regions of Germany than in the Polish regions of Russia, simply because Germany was a more economically developed country. More important, the Poles in the western region of Poland, having been part of the German economy, were a more economically developed people. In the ex-Prussian western regions, both the peasantry and the bourgeoisie were economically enterprising. In the southern and eastern regions, the peasantry was generally more primitive, and the Polish middle class was heavily composed of members of the professions and bureaucrats, allowing the specifically economic bourgeoisie to remain predominantly Jewish. Even the landscape reflected these differences. In the ex-German areas, frequent small towns, which were loci of agricultural marketing and processing industries, and collieries and foundries dotted the countryside, while in much of the rest of Poland the endless vista of fields, forests, and villages interspersed with an occasional city, which functioned mainly as an administrative and garrison center, prevailed. During the war that preceded its independence, and which made that independence possible, Poland had suffered major economic and social losses in the battles that raged across its territory under different flags. These losses included the destruction of more than 40% of its bridges, 63% of its railroad stations, and
Wow. They were just in
48%
the
of the
middle
rolling
of the
stock.
war and everything.
In addition, 450,000 Poles were killed in the war, fighting in the armies of the various contending powers. More fundamental than even these large losses, which could be made up over time, was the fact that Poland was still not a major industrial nation. As late as the 1930s, only 30% of its population was urban.
Wow, there's still so much more history, that I would need to check out. This is just like a little part of it. It was getting more interesting and then it kind of just ended, but I'm very sure there are still lots of other, videos that would actually help explain more histories, complicated histories about Poland, but it actually really sounded complicated because of a few things that I mentioned initially. Like, I really don't know, how they were able to stand as a nation on their own if they were being attacked from different angles, like the war from the Germany and Russia and all that, and they were like in the middle. So it was like they felt more of they felt more coming from the different sides. So it was really, I can imagine, like really difficult for them, knowing that they're actually like very hardworking. Especially he kept mentioning agriculture. They were very good in that, and I always have that sense of feeling like they're very hardworking, like naturally like hardworking people. And yeah, there's so much more that I would need to learn, not just Poland. There are lots of histories of other countries, of even Nigeria, where I come from, that I really don't even know, that I still would want to, go deeper and get to learn more just for myself, to get to, know what and how I came, where I am today, and how the history of where I am in the UK, Poland, Nigeria, just around the world. It's something that one should know. It's quite interesting. Anyway, I will definitely be going deeper and deeper. And just in case you find out or you have any other kind of videos you need me to check out on such histories, I will be delighted to, check it out, just to learn more about histories and all that. Well, guys, thank you all so much for hanging and checking out this with me. Remember to subscribe to my channel, and I'll see you all in my next video. From me, it's bye.